one of the biggest records that changed my life is Super Unknown from Soundgarden.
And I was just playing it for people, and everyone was just like, dude, this is next level.
And it was unbelievable to see just how people were reacting to Pearl Jam at that period of time.
At a certain point, you can love something to death, or you can strangle the very essence it needs to breathe.
Because look at what we do, it's pretty intense. Like getting up in front of thousands and thousands of people and then exposing yourself to criticism. It can be pretty scary, but
it's not a unique story. It's not a unique story to rock and roll in general. It's been happening since the 60s.
By 1992, grunge was becoming more and more popular as time went on. Nirvana's Nevermind reached the top of the albums chart in January, knocking Michael Jackson's Dangerous from the top. MTV was playing their videos, as well as Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, and Alice in Chains regularly. Record labels scrambled to find their own version of Nirvana so they could release their own Nevermind. The Cameron Crowe-directed film Singles featured cameos from several Seattle musicians. And grunge fashion was now a fashion.
This bizarre fascination with their fashion. Like, what is that about? When the New York Times comes a call in and they want to know, let's talk about the band's fashion. There was not a lot of fashion sense, conscious fashion sense going into the bands that became popular in the 90s.
As far as fashion, grunge fashion, Jesus criminy. I remember the first time I saw Eddie's equivalent of the brown denim jacket that he wore so much on tour on the runway during Fashion Week in New York. And I was just like, oh, dear God. The commercialism and the fashion statements and the Doc Martens and the flannel. Okay, all right, I'll acknowledge that the Seattle music and how we just did what we wanted and wore what we wanted and really didn't make a big deal out of it. If we did, it was usually in parody. The fact that influenced fashion all the way up to, New York's fashion stage. Okay, yeah, we're badasses, but it wasn't by design. Good Lord.
The flannels and oversized coats didn't actually make it to the runways until 1993, though. So we need to back it up a little bit, because there are a couple of imperative things that happened toward the end of '92. Firstly, Pearl Jam's 10 peaked at number 2 on the Billboard 200 nearly a year after its release. This was the second grunge album to make it into the top 10 of the chart, and the group headlined that year's Lollapalooza festival alongside Soundgarden, Red Hot Chili Peppers, the Jesus and Mary Chain, and more.
When Pearl Jam blew up, and out of nowhere, when they first were booked on the bill for Lollapalooza, they were booked early in the afternoon, like before bands that were bigger at the time. But the thing was, they blew up so fast because of radio play that when the band would start the set, like with Even Flow, all of a sudden people would swell the stage out of nowhere, and they would have one of the biggest crowds of the day. And it was unbelievable to see just how people were reacting to Pearl Jam at that period of time.
And of course, a month later, Alice in Chains put out perhaps one of the greatest releases from this era in music, the iconic, dark, and foreboding Dirt. Alice had already established themselves as one of the gloomier bands with their debut Facelift 2 years prior, but Dirt took it to a whole new level. Loneliness, depression, and hopelessness were some of the main topics discussed in Lane Staley and Jerry Cantrell's lyrics throughout the album, but the most prominent was addiction. In an interview Staley did with Rolling Stone, he noted that the record basically tells the story of someone who used drugs to deal with pain and anguish and how much it helped, but eventually realized over time that they're actually hurting him more than helping. That story was about Staley himself. He hoped to send the message to his fans that drugs don't actually solve the problems for you. Dirt peaked at number 6 on the albums chart just a few weeks after its release, but we do need to touch on another album that came out that same day, Stone Temple Pilots' Core. Though they were from San Diego, Stone Temple Pilots certainly could have been mistaken for a Seattle band when they first arrived in the scene. However, just as Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Alice in Chains, and Soundgarden all sounded vastly different from each other, so did STP, and Scott Weiland's confident onstage demeanor set him apart from the frontmen of the other groups.
And then you got to think about the bands that weren't from Seattle, but also, were great bands that came out in that era, like the Pumpkins and Stone Temple Pilots. I mean, I love those bands. And there was that effect as well, of everything that was kind of happening at the time. Like when Dean DeLeo from Stone Temple Pilots came to my radio station in New Jersey, he was still driving a delivery truck. He was back in New Jersey working for the time being. They just finished Core, and he had a copy of Core in a long box. And he said, hey man, we got signed to Atlantic, me and my brother Robert, and we got this band called Stone Temple Pilots. I remember being the first person to ever play Stone Temple Pilots on the radio because he brought that record he just got it. I had to break open the long box with the plastic around it.
The fall of 1993 gave us the next two major releases from Seattle: Nirvana's third and final studio album In Utero on September 13th, and Pearl Jam's Versus on October 19th. Both albums peaked at number 1 on the Billboard 200 within weeks of their release, and then a couple of months later, Alice in Chains' 1994 EP Jar of Flies, which was their first release featuring new bassist Mike Inez, became the first EP to ever top the chart. While all of these accolades would seem to be a great feat for any band, this extremely sudden success was beginning to take its toll on various members of the Seattle scene.
I think they felt they were losing control at some point of things. And when things got so big, certainly I think that, Kurt was really conflicted. I think at this time where he wanted to be the biggest rock star in the world, but then he felt guilty about it because he came from this indie scene and kind of loathed a lot of the bands that had gotten really huge. There's that confliction with Kurt Cobain, but Kurt embraced it, but I think it happened so fast it was very, very hard for him. Eddie Vedder handled it a very different way, which was pretty amazing. Like he, decided that after things really started to blow up, that they were going to take control of their own career and not make videos anymore. They didn't make videos for years. So he didn't want to do things that he felt like the industry had pushed him into doing it. So he decided after Jeremy had blown up so big, they weren't going to do videos. And then when Versus came out, it sold 950,000 copies in the first week, which I think was a record at that time for a first week album sale.
There's sort of a meteoric rise in the success of Pearl Jam and Nirvana experience. It was primarily from videos and radio airplay. They hadn't really done the kind of touring that, say, we had done. We're still growing at a slower rate. We're doing what we do. We have songs that are certainly more radio friendly than many other bands because we did have some radio and MTV success. We didn't have that kind of success that Nirvana or Pearl Jam had for video. I think the biggest strength from our video success was, hey, cute lead singer, which seemed to work in the 80s. That, of course, that wasn't a goal. We didn't go out and take a hammer and chisel and make Chris look that way. He just did. So yeah, we because we weren't as huge, they can make decisions like pull back on radio or pull back on video. We couldn't quite do that same thing because we still needed that as a vehicle to promote ourselves, and we still had to keep touring and doing the interviews and then writing. So yeah, it was different for us.
Soundgarden may not have reached the same level as Pearl Jam and Nirvana as quickly, but in March of 1994, they released their most commercially successful album to date, Super Unknown, which became their first #1 album and earned them 2 Grammy Awards with the hits Black Hole Sun and Spoon Man.
Well, there was pressure from the record label to use a name producer. We used Michael Beinhorn, but Chris and Kim they really wanted to fine tune stuff. Ben and I kind of did our parts pretty quickly at the beginning, and then we just kind of handed it over to Kim and Chris. That we made clear from the get-go is like, okay, we kind of produce ourselves. We definitely took, we did take input. We weren't like completely bad to work with in that sense, but we never let anyone like there was never any talk of like, oh, can you change the chorus? Can you shorten up the bridge? Can you take out, it's like, no. Like, no one ever had that conversation with us, which I always thought was really cool. I do remember after Brendan O'Brien mixed the album, we all like had a couple beers and smoked a joint or something, and we blasted the album at the studio we're working at. And I remember like leaving that listening session and just thinking, damn, we fucking did it.
One of the biggest records that changed my life, just the way that I view songwriting, specifically songwriting, is Super Unknown from Soundgarden. I mean, anyone that knows me knows how much of an affection I have for that band, especially Chris Cornell. Earlier Soundgarden albums, you could tell that he was trying to kind of find his footing. But when Super Unknown came out, it was just front to back. Like, what in the hell is this beautiful piece of art? Like, this is amazing.
And those bands were obviously not all that comfortable with the success. I think the other thing that, we have to think about is the reason why we've lost so many members of those bands is because, they had to go out and they had to live their pain, their emotional and physical abuse they had been through. They didn't live it every night, because I think the thing about the bands was that they were writing about real things they felt. That was an extension of what was really going on in their minds and in their souls. And it's a really hard thing, I think, for some people to live that every single night, and it could take its toll. And I think that's why so many people had gotten into drug abuse, and just trying to get out of themselves, so that they're not living that pain, because a lot of times artists can't separate who they are, from the person on the stage.
I wonder if creatives, because they are so much more sensitive, they kind of surf a broader range of emotions more quickly, more on a regular basis, so they can see more up and down. I don't want to make that connection without like data and information. But I have heard that said before, and it does seem like artists are a little off. Like, I don't know why.
As unfortunate as it is to say, drugs were a big part of the Seattle scene. Mother Love Bone's Andrew Wood, who we discussed in the last episode, certainly wasn't the only victim of addiction. After Nevermind became massive, Kurt Cobain admitted to having an on and off relationship with heroin in interviews. However, Nirvana manager Danny Goldberg told the LA Times that he seemed to really want to get clean and stay clean when his and Courtney Love's daughter, Frances Bean Cobain, was born in 1992. But in March of 1994, Cobain was rushed to a hospital in Rome, Italy after Love found him on the floor. He'd ingested alcohol and a large amount of pills and slipped into an overdose-induced coma. Love also recalled he'd been severely depressed when he first arrived in Italy. She was convinced that he intentionally overdosed to kill himself. Sometime in the following weeks, Love and some of Cobain's other comrades set up an intervention with him. Love had struggles of her own, so she flew down to LA and checked into rehab, and he followed suit shortly after. However, he didn't stay long, and on April 8th, he was found dead in his greenhouse from a gunshot wound.
The people that they associated themselves with on a business level were not around when things were starting out, and certainly saw no interest in us or any reason why we should be considered anything other than an annoyance. And I think that kind of translated into their heads as well to some degree, although it's not Kurt's, because he died so young. And I can happily say without any trouble that I didn't like most of the people that were around. I didn't like the people that were surrounding him, that they were paying to do their business for him. I wasn't excited about any of that. So kind of ruined the whole thing. And then you put the drugs into all of it and how it all ended. I don't have a lot of happy memories about any of that stuff. It's clouded by a weird tapestry of tragedy. We were getting off a plane from the tour that we had just been on with them, which was not a happy time. They played their very last show, which was in Munich. We played it with them, and then they canceled the next day and canceled the rest of the shows we were going to do with them. We went on to do our own tour after that. When we landed in the U.S., we found out from our road manager who met us at the airport that's what had happened. It's just a terrible thing. I wish it had ended differently, but Honestly, I wish that he would never have been famous and was still alive, because we were friends long before any of that stuff happened. When everybody was penniless. I'd much rather have him that way and alive than dead and the history of Nirvana, personally.
The day that Kurt died, and it was just such a crazy, I remember just the way everybody felt. The shock was incredible. And, little did we know what would come down the line, losing more people from the scene. But that was it was a really horrible thing. I think that Kurt would have gone and done a lot of different things and gone in a lot of different directions. I think Nirvana would have experimented with other different sounds. I think they were already considering doing different things.
The crazy thing is I'd seen him a couple weeks earlier, and he'd given me his phone number, and I actually woke up that morning thinking, I should call Kurt. Courtney was always kind of bugging me to go because Kurt needed better friends, she said. And I'm like, yeah, I'll give him a call. And I'm like, it's only 10 a.m. I'll give him another hour or two at least. And then the phone rang, and that was Entertainment Weekly. And then call waiting was Rolling Stone. And then it just sort of went like that. By that Friday, when I had everything out and there was nothing to be done for the weekend, I went and had a nice dinner by myself and just kind of, broke down.
I was in shock, but I was not surprised. He had been OD'd in Rome just a month before. It still puts you in shock. You love these people, you care about these people.
The loss of Kurt Cobain, for many people, I wouldn't say locally, but for many people would signify the death of the local music scene. It was a monumental event and impact that changes how you look at stuff.
While the death of Kurt Cobain signaled the end of Nirvana, it didn't necessarily put an end to grunge's reign, though things certainly started to change within some of the other dominating bands at the time.
It's not a local club scene anymore. It's an international, global lens that is being focused on these people. And, there is no question that the double-edged sword of stardom starts putting pressure on a community, starts putting pressure on bands, starts putting pressure on individual musicians. I remember Eddie coming by the radio station when Time magazine chose to put his face on the cover of their magazine even after Kurt and Ed both declined. What price or what pressure that put on him to be the face of a generation or the face of a community of music. How pissed he was.
I think that they weren't necessarily prepared for it. I don't think anybody could be prepared for it at that young of an age. When you take an area of people that were already kind of in a downtrodden area, or they're coming from really modest means, if you will, and then all of a sudden the rest of the world hears it and it's this explosion because it's a brand new sound. And you take these young men and women that were just kind of living their lives, loving playing music, doing what they always do, but all of a sudden the world is now paying attention. And I shudder to think that necessarily Kurt Cobain realized he was going to be the voice of a generation, but he was.
It's a lot for a young person at any time in life, whether they're an entertainer or whether they're a sports figure. The sort of adulation that young people get at these apexes of their careers is not normal. And honestly, somebody needs to do a really serious study about it, because it can inflict a lot of grief, it can inflict a lot of confusion. There is a lot to be said about taking things slowly. Sometimes you don't have that option when the juggernaut is chugging along. People have to decide, I'm going to keep going with it or I'm going to take a different direction.
Pearl Jam's Mike McCready went to rehab in 1994, where he met John Baker Saunders, who had played in the Walkabouts. Upon returning home to Seattle, the musicians joined Barrett Martin of Skinyard and Screaming Trees to form a band, but they needed a singer. Lane Staley had been in and out of rehab to treat his own heroin addiction many times during those few years that Alice in Chains were on top of the world. So McCready invited him to participate in the project, and he later revealed that he hoped their newfound sobriety would inspire each other to stay clean. This supergroup, which also featured guest vocals from Screaming Trees' Mark Lanigan, came to be known as Mad Season, and their sole album, Above, came out in March of 1995, just a few months prior to Alice in Chains' third self-titled record, which debuted at #1 on the charts. Alice in Chains released an entertaining mockumentary home video called The Nona Tapes as a means of promoting the album, but they chose not to do a full tour in support of it. They did, however, perform a legendary MTV Unplugged set in April of 1996.
Alice in Chains Unplugged. The last night that I saw Lane Staley alive, I walked up on stage with a couple of the other MTV people after the taping ended. And I walked up to Lane. I just said, "Hey, Lane, man, it was really great tonight." And he said, "Well, thanks, Matt. He goes, I got to get out of here." And it was because his girlfriend, of course, had been rushed to the hospital. He had found that out, so Sony put him on the Sony jet and flew him back to Seattle.
They played a handful of shows later that year with Kiss, too. But Staley's addiction was starting to get the best of him, and a few months later, his former fiancée Demry Parrott, who's depicted with Staley on the cover of the Mad Season album, died as a result of her own struggle with drugs. Various reports note that Staley was put on 24-hour suicide watch after her death, and he became a recluse.
When Alice dropped from public eye, it's no secret, it was a brutal battle with addiction, and during that time was also had come after the success of their studio albums and world tours, and it's a lot. So at that point for Alice, the success and the excess had become damaging, where they wanted to sort of reel it in, and Lane started doing another project with Mike McCready and Barrett Martin and Baker Saunders called Mad Season. Jerry worked on a solo record. Alice in Chains hadn't broken up. During that time, they needed to get another perspective. And the demons of addiction, they don't rest. And we've had far too many lose that battle from our community. But it's not a unique story. It's not a unique story to rock and roll in general. It's been happening since the 60s.
That was never not a part of the scene up there. I'm sure it's a part of every rock and roll scene anywhere to some degree. Washington State is a depressing place. Cloudy and rainy, and it's really nice maybe 3 months a year. And there's heavy alcoholism and heroin addiction, but there's heroin addiction and alcoholism everywhere. I don't know that scene, it may just be a coincidence if it's that scene, but it's definitely more depressing there. That was the most depressing time of my life, was living there. I'm a much happier, much more productive, much better person in every way once I got out of there. I don't know why.
The bands didn't have problems. Individuals within those bands had problems. There's an aspect of drug culture that was very much not shared socially in the music culture. So those individuals that you may know of to have had drug problems perhaps had their addiction issues within the context of being in a band, but it was not indicative of that band. I can safely say that that was not an issue for Soundgarden. We drank like any other jerks would drink, and even that was, there's a lightweightedness to some of the people who were there. Because the drug culture, there's something about it that's insular. There's involves a private shared thing with those people, and there's probably a component of it that involves shame. So they're not telling you, "Hey man, I just went and shot up" or whatever. They're not. That's their thing. It's a private, personal thing. So I think the rest of us were not always aware of these little pockets of behaviors that individuals were engaging in. I'd want to absolve the scene and community of responsibility for the choices made, the very personal choices that some individuals made.
I didn't necessarily go into rehab, and I didn't necessarily do a steps program or what have you. But if you know anything about me and my history, I'm a drug addict and I'm an alcoholic, and I will be forever, because there's a guy in here that his sole mission is to kill me. So I understand that element and how distorted substances can make you. What it was with that era too, I think, is it was hard drugs. It was heroin, spike in the vein. It was speedball, cocaine addiction, massive addictions to opioids. And so when you're talking about these hard drugs, that, where it ain't fun anymore, it was binging these substances and having a warped sensibility with these young minds, thinking that they needed that. And a lot of times they were doing it to cope, because once again, the quick rise. And I'm glad we have all the music. I'm glad we have all the songs, but I hate the fact that we had to lose these people, certain very influential people, to substances because people didn't know how to talk to them. And it could have possibly been prevented.
From what I know, addiction, and it comes in many forms: alcoholism, drug addiction, gambling. It's just pick your drug. The disease is the disease. It's centered in the mind. I can speak on alcoholism and drug addiction, but the main thing is in an addict brain. And listen, I'm not a professional. I'm just going to give you what I know. With alcohol, it's like a physical craving for alcohol coupled with a disease that's centered in the mind. And for far too long, I feel like society and the media and school has portrayed addicts and alcoholics as bad people. There are highly functioning people with the disease of addiction. This disease does not discriminate. There's all colors of the rainbow. And just from my experience, I would get so nervous on stage, so I would drink, because look at what we do. It's pretty intense. Getting up in front of thousands and thousands of people and then exposing yourself to criticism. It can be pretty scary, but...
Around this time, Soundgarden released their final album before going on a hiatus as well. Down on the Upside came out in May of '96, but the band didn't last much longer after that.
We had a couple really tough tours. No one was happy. There's a lot of drinking and just sloppy shows. So it seemed like we really needed to just kind of regroup once we got back from that 96, 97 tour. But I just kind of went into work mode when we got off the road. I started writing demos, and I was just like, yeah, let's do our next record. Yeah. And then Chris came over one day and quit the band. So that's how it ended.
By this point, Pearl Jam had released the albums Vitalogy and No Code and engaged in a boycott against Ticketmaster because they didn't want their fans to have to pay high fees in order to see them play live. Since Ticketmaster controlled many major venues, they weren't able to perform in the US for several years. Following the disbandment of Soundgarden, Matt Cameron went on to join Pearl Jam.
I was working on a record with my buddy John McBain. I called up Stone at the time, who had a record label called Loose Grooves, and I called to inquire about putting out my band with John. And then Eddie got on the phone. He said, "Hey, what are you doing this summer?" I would love to go on tour with Pearl Jam. I mean, who wouldn't, But it was a sort of a fill-in. It was a fill-in for Jack Irons kind of situation when I first joined. They had this tour booked, and Jack quit sort of, I don't know, maybe a month or two before the tour was going to start. So we were we made a mad dash to the rehearsal space and just kind of went through all the songs as much as possible. It took me a while to kind of get all the music learned properly, and but it was a really fun challenge.
While the big guns in grunge were either taking breaks or just simply slowing down, other genres started to come to the forefront of the music industry, including post-grunge and, even more so, nu metal. Grunge wasn't dead, but it wasn't the hot new topic anymore.
There is almost always historically, there is finite times in any sort of cultural movement. That's the nature of art. It keeps evolving. So the bands in Seattle in this particular movement that was under the umbrella of grunge, they got a really great run out of it. So tragedies aside, there was destined to be an obsolescence of a very tight-knit scene. It just doesn't, we don't all stay in college forever, comparison. That said, the deaths of our friends were sobering, sombering, painful experiences that absolutely gave people pause.
I think because it had gotten so big and because the mainstream had embraced it, I feel like that could have had something to do with it, where it just that people just moved on, and that's just kind of what happens with art, with music. Once something becomes that big, that much of a force, then styles change and trends change and tastes change. And
yeah, I think there was some burnout in the mid to late 90s on grunge. You know, anything that gets overhyped or oversaturated, there's going to be a backlash against it, you know, until it's not there anymore, and then everyone, you know, embraces it again. And I think that sort of needed to happen with grunge, particularly, you know, and the fact that Nirvana wasn't around anymore didn't help. It just had become another sort of settled rock scene.
And the waning of the music scene, I don't know, you could probably find a scientific algorithm to the concept of absolute saturation. You couldn't get away from Seattle. I'd say 95 on would be when the pressure started to back off. Everything seemed to be coming out of Seattle. So at a certain point, you know, the media monoliths are probably wondering, you know, what else is there out there? Or God, not another Seattle band. Which I felt bad for a lot of the Seattle artists that, you know, had releases in the mid 90s and on, because just from burnout, global burnout, it can tend to affect the success or failure of a record.
With Alice in Chains on hiatus, Jerry Cantrell released his first solo record in March of 1998. The last songs Alice recorded together with Lane were around 1998 and 1999 and were titled Get Born Again and Died. Alice in Chains fans all know how this story ends, and while there are various reports of sightings of Staley in the late 90s from different people, we don't have a right to speculate about his physical state while he was choosing to stay out of the public eye. All we know for sure are the facts. The singer was found dead in his condo in April of 2002, and the tragedy was ruled an accidental overdose.
And you know, I think many of us, sadly, didn't think that Lane would live that long after his girlfriend passed away. But he lived a lot longer than I think a lot of us expected him to. Of course, the hope, you know, we prayed that Lane would get well and get better, and that he would, you know, find a way to come out of it, like Mark Lanegan did. But Lane, was never able to pull himself out of it, and it was sad.
I remember when Lane passed, getting the news. I remember being at his memorial. I didn't cry when Andrew passed. I didn't cry when Kurt passed. But when I attended Lane's memorial, the tears came for all of them.
The music and the lyrics of Alice in Chains could understandably have created a misrepresentation of Lane. Lane absolutely carried a lot of pain. He also was one of the sweetest, really. He was a sweet person. He had an incredible sense of mischief. So in his sweetness, he also loved to do many mischievous things. And I'm not talking about suffering from addiction being a mischievous thing. I'm talking about putting fart cushions underneath couch cushions. You know, that sort of merrymaking and mirth was his. He literally had a physical twinkle in his eye, and he didn't have any sense of ego that can often come along with someone that has the responsibility of having the the microphone, being a singer, being a focal point. It can make people in that position have walls up. And Layne didn't have walls up. Talk about a fashion master with following no one else's drum. My God, we didn't know what color hair, how long, clothes. He was so incredibly creative in terms of his persona, his physical persona. He was an amazing young man.
As we'll discuss in the next and final episode of this series, Layne Staley wasn't the last member of the Seattle scene that we lost prematurely. But rather than harping on the casualties, we're also going to discuss the impact that grunge in Seattle had on rock and roll for generations to come.